Reading Day is celebrated around the world. I believe that today, tomorrow and Monday and Tuesday there is more than 25 locations around the world celebrating this event. The Tolkien Reading Day was first introduced in 2003 by the Tolkien Society in Britain, which is the oldest Tolkien society. And the reason why March 25th was chosen, that is the calendar date that Tolkien gives in The Lord of the Rings of the fall of Sauron. So it's a date of celebration. Okay, I'm just going to do a very brief introductory about Tolkien himself. And as you know, a hobbit hole. And in a hole in the ground, well, there lived the hobbit, this jumped one. This is a picture of Tolkien when he was very young. Now, Tolkien was born in 1892. He was actually born in Bloemfontein in Africa. His parents were English. His father was a bank teller, or bank manager, I should say. And his father was a bank manager, and the family had him and his wife had migrated there for the duration of his work in the bank there. And while they were there, they had two boys, John Ronald Rule and Hillary was the other boy's name. But when they were very young, their mother, I've lost her name. Their mother, whose name was Mabel, she took the boys back to England and was to await. Arthur had another year to go on his contract in South Africa, and he was to return and join them a year later. But unfortunately, he got extremely ill and passed away before he returned to England. And their mother didn't have any substantial income to support the boys. Because she had left the Protestant faith and married a Catholic, she wasn't getting any support from her side of the family, only from Arthur's side of the family, Arthur being the father, who had passed away in Africa. When Tolkien himself, John Ronald Rule, when he was 12 years of age, his mother got diabetes and she passed away as well. And back in those days, of course, there was no cure for diabetes. So now they were orphans, and they were sponsored by Father Francis Morgan. That was the priest's name I was trying to remember before. But they were shifted around from boarding houses to relatives, back to boarding houses, back to relatives. But all the time, Father Francis Morgan was sponsoring the boys and giving them a good education at college. Now, at an early age, Tolkien himself showed brilliant linguistic skills, and he was always in Latin and Greek originally, and he was also very interested in fairy stories and old legends of Old Norse and Germanic legends, and legends of Finland and legends of Iceland. Now, he grew up in Sarehole, which is just outside Birmingham in those days. But today, of course, Sarehole is well within the limits of the Birmingham city. Back in those days, it was a rural area, and just down the road was an old mill. Now, if anybody's familiar with the Hobbit story, there is a mill just down the road. So a lot of his surroundings in this rural setting gave him ideas in later life to write about the Shire and the mill and the Green Dragon Inn and so on. There's other buildings in the area too that influenced some of his ideas. But also, of course, his knowledge of Germanic, Nordic, Icelandic and Finnish legends. And because he was a linguist, later on he became very proficient at Germanic. Goth Germanic. He also became very proficient at Finnish and the Finnish legends, and also very proficient in the Icelandic Nordic type of language and their legends. And all of those things, and the Germanic legends, all of those things influenced his writings later on. And there are a lot of things in his stories that have parallels to different legends from those different northern countries. For instance, the dragon is very similar to the dragon in Beowulf. Now, if you're not aware of it, Tolkien was the very first person to translate Beowulf, and his translation, his version, is going to be released as a publication in May this year. And the Tolkien world are all going, "Yippee, about time." And he did that translation 90 years ago. At the age of 16, Tolkien was staying in a boarding house, and he met a very young lady called Edith Bratt. That's her up there. And she was 19 years of age. Now, when Father Francis found out there was a relationship going on between the two, and it was going on for a considerable amount of time, they kept it secret, and they were meeting secretly, and so on. He put his foot down and said, "You are not to have any further contact with this girl," because she was a Protestant and he was a Catholic, and because she was much older than him. "You're not to have any more contact with this girl until you turn 21. But Tolkien never gave up on the dream of marrying this girl. The day he turned 21, he jumped on a train, went over to the town where she lived, knocked on her door and said, "Will you marry me?" And they finally got married. They were married in January 1913. Now, the following year, of course, World War I broke out, and Tolkien was immediately enlisted into the army. But because he was a student at Oxford, he was allowed to finish his degree at Oxford, and therefore his actual time in the army was put off until 1915. He got his degree with honours, and then he was sent off to the war in France, and he actually was involved in the Somme, the Battle of the Somme. And he obviously saw a lot of tragic things in the trenches and in the mud of France. And a lot of people say he got a lot of ideas for his Mordor from those experiences. While he was in France, 3 of his best friends were killed in the war, and then he himself got trench fever and was repatriated back to England. French fever is like a continual diarrhea and vomiting and things like that, so you really need sort of good care. So he remained in the forces as a home guard type of officer, a lieutenant he was. After the war, he took up a position as he continued his studies at Oxford, and in 1920 he took up a position at the Birmingham Leeds University, my mistake, the Leeds University, as Associate Professor in English Language. And it was only a few years later, in 1925, he returned to Oxford and became the Professor of Anglo-Saxon English. And then in later years, he became the Professor of English at Oxford. That's Tolkien in his war years. Now, Tolkien became involved in a group called the Inklings, and one of his greatest friends was a man called C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Narnia books. So Tolkien and Narnia became Narnia and Lewis became friends, and that friendship continued on for quite a few years. He wrote many other stories besides The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. He wrote the Father Christmas Letters, which I highly recommend for you to read. It's full of beautiful, there it is, just hold it up, yeah. It's full of beautiful coloured illustrations, great book for kids to read at Christmas time. He wrote Mr. Bliss, which was really his own experience of buying his first motor car. And of course he wrote The Hobbit. I won't go into all the details now because I've run out of time, but I just want to give you a little bit of a background on Tolkien himself and on Tolkien reading